David Williams stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the old brick building that housed Romano's Italian kitchen. The restaurant had seen better days. Paint was peeling from the window frames and the neon sign flickered weakly in the evening light. But David saw something different when he looked at this place. He saw potential. At 43 years old, David had learned to see opportunities where others saw problems. It hadn't always been this way. Growing up in a small apartment with his grandmother, he remembered nights when dinner was just bread and whatever leftovers she brought home from her cleaning job. His grandmother always told him that hard work and respect for others would take him far in life. She was right, though the journey had been longer and harder than either of them imagined. David's first restaurant experience came when he was 16, washing dishes at a busy diner downtown. The owner, an old Greek man named Tony, saw something in the quiet teenager who never complained about the long hours or the hot, steamy kitchen. Tony taught David everything about the restaurant business, from how to read customers to the importance of fresh ingredients. More importantly, he taught David that treating people right was the foundation of any successful business. After high school, David worked his way up from dishwasher to line cook to assistant manager. He saved every penny he could, living in a tiny studio apartment and riding the bus to work even when he could afford a car. His dream was always to own his own place, but he knew he needed to learn the business inside and out first. The breakthrough came when David was 28. He had saved enough money to buy a small food truck that was going out of business. The previous owner was selling everything cheap just to get out of debt. David spent every weekend fixing up that truck, painting it bright yellow and blue and perfecting his menu. He called it Grandma's Kitchen in honor of the woman who raised him, starting with just himself and one part-time helper. David parked his food truck outside office buildings during lunch hours and near college campuses in the evenings. He served simple, honest food at fair prices. Grilled chicken with rice and vegetables, hearty sandwiches, fresh salads, and his grandmother's famous mac and cheese recipe that always sold out first. Word spread quickly about the friendly guy in the yellow truck who remembered your name and your order. David treated every customer like family, whether they were construction workers buying a quick lunch or business executives grabbing dinner on their way home. He never raised prices just because someone looked like they could afford it, and he never treated anyone poorly based on how they dressed or spoke. Within 3 years, David had enough success to open his first real restaurant. It was a small place in a strip mall, nothing fancy, but it was his. He kept the same philosophy that made his food truck successful: good food, fair prices, and treating everyone with respect. The restaurant did so well that he was able to open a second location within 2 years. Now, 15 years after that first food truck, David owned 11 restaurants across the city. Each one was profitable, each one employed local people at good wages, and each one maintained his grandmother's values of hard work and treating people right. His staff knew that David would back them up when they did the right thing, and customers knew they could count on a good meal and fair treatment at any of his restaurants. But David never forgot where he came from. He still drove a modest car and lived in the same neighborhood where he grew up, though in a much nicer house that he bought for his grandmother before she passed away 5 years ago. He put his younger cousin through college and quietly helped other family members when they needed it. Success hadn't changed his values. It had just given him more ways to live them. So when David walked past Romano's Italian kitchen that evening 3 weeks ago, he saw more than a struggling restaurant. He saw a chance to bring his philosophy to a part of downtown that needed it. The location was perfect, right in the heart of the business district where office workers and tourists gathered. But something about the place felt off even from the outside. David had done his research before making an offer. Romano's had been family-owned for 20 years, but the original owners had gotten older and couldn't keep up with the demands of running a restaurant. They had hired a manager to help, but profits kept dropping and customer complaints kept rising. Finally, they decided to sell rather than watch their life's work continue to decline. The paperwork had taken weeks to complete. David's lawyer handled most of the details while David focused on his other restaurants. He always bought properties through his investment company, Romano Holdings, which kept his name out of the public records. It was easier that way, and it avoided any complications during negotiations. Now the sale was final. David owned Romano's Italian kitchen, though nobody working there knew it yet. His plan was simple but important. Before he announced any changes or revealed his identity, He wanted to visit the restaurant as a regular customer. He needed to see exactly what was happening, how the staff treated people, and what needed to be fixed. David had learned this lesson years ago when he bought his fourth restaurant. He had trusted the previous owner's description of a well-run operation with great staff, only to discover later that the manager had been cutting corners on food quality and treating customers poorly. It took months to repair the damage to the restaurant's reputation. Since then, David always did his own investigation before making any changes. Tomorrow evening, David would walk into Romano's Italian kitchen as just another customer looking for a good meal. He would dress casually, nothing that would make him stand out. He would order food, observe the service, and see firsthand what kind of experience the restaurant was providing. Only then would he decide what changes needed to be made. David suspected there might be problems based on the online reviews he had read. Too many customers complained about rude service and overpriced, poor-quality food, but he wanted to see for himself before making any judgments. Maybe the reviews were from difficult customers, or maybe there were issues that could be easily fixed with better training. As David walked back to his car, he felt the familiar mix of excitement and responsibility that came with each new restaurant. This wasn't just about making money, though he expected Romano's to be profitable once the problems were solved. This was about creating a place where people felt welcome, where they could count on a good meal and fair treatment, and where his employees could build careers they could be proud of. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory as he drove home. "Treat people the way you want to be treated, David. Do that and you'll never go wrong." Tomorrow he would find out if the people running Romano's Italian kitchen had learned that same lesson. David chose Friday evening for his visit to Romano's, knowing that busy nights often revealed the true character of a restaurant's service. He dressed in simple jeans and a plain black t-shirt, nothing that would suggest he had money or influence. He wanted to experience exactly what any regular customer would face walking through those doors. The restaurant was busier than he expected when he arrived at 7 o'clock. Good, he thought. A busy restaurant would give him a real picture of how the staff handled pressure and treated different types of customers. He stood in the small waiting area, watching the dining room through the glass partition. The hostess looked up when he approached her stand. She was a young woman, maybe early 20s, with blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail. Her smile disappeared the moment she saw him, replaced by a look that was somewhere between annoyance and suspicion. "Do you have a reservation?" she asked, not bothering with any greeting. "No, I don't," David replied politely. "Just looking for a table for one if you have anything available." The hostess looked past him toward the door, as if expecting someone more important to walk in. "We're pretty busy tonight. It might be a long wait." David glanced into the dining room. While many tables were occupied, he could clearly see several empty tables scattered throughout the restaurant. "That's okay," he said. "About how long do you think?" "Maybe an hour," she said without checking any reservation book or wait list. "I can put your name down if you want." David gave her his first name and waited. He watched as she seated 3 different parties who arrived after him, including a couple who had also walked in without a reservation. Each time she greeted them with enthusiasm and found them tables immediately. The pattern was becoming clear, but David wanted to see how far it would go. After 25 minutes, he approached the hostess' stand again. "Excuse me, I was wondering about my table." "Still waiting on something to open up," she said without looking up from her phone. At that moment, a server finished cleaning a table near the kitchen. The hostess continued scrolling through her phone. "It looks like that table might be ready," David suggested politely. "Oh, that one?" The hostess glanced over. "That's not really a good table. Very noisy back there by the kitchen." David watched as she seated the next party at a prime window table that had been available the entire time he had been waiting. "The table by the kitchen would be fine," he said. With obvious reluctance, the hostess grabbed a menu and led him to the table near the kitchen doors. She dropped the menu on the table without a word and walked away. David settled into his seat and began observing the restaurant more carefully. The difference in service was striking. At the tables around him, he watched servers chatting warmly with customers, making recommendations and checking frequently to see if everything was satisfactory. His own table seemed to exist in a different world. 20 minutes passed before anyone even brought him water. When a server finally approached, it was a middle-aged man who seemed rushed and irritated. "You ready to order?" he asked without introduction or any attempt at pleasantries. David looked at the menu quickly. The prices were higher than he expected for the quality of restaurant Romano's appeared to be. "I'll have the chicken parmesan and a side salad," he said. "What kind of dressing?" "Italian, please." The server wrote nothing down and walked away without another word. David continued watching the other tables, noting how the same server was friendly and attentive with other customers. When he brought bread baskets to other tables, he skipped David's entirely. 45 minutes later, David's food arrived. The server set the plate down with a small thud, splashing some of the sauce onto the table. "Anything else?" he asked, already turning away. David looked at his meal. The chicken was clearly reheated, dry around the edges and lukewarm in the center. The pasta was overcooked and swimming in sauce that tasted like it came from a jar. The side salad was wilted lettuce with a few tired tomato pieces and what looked like store-bought croutons. At the table next to him, a well-dressed couple was enjoying what appeared to be a completely different meal. Their food looked fresh and well-prepared, and their server had checked on them 3 times since their meal arrived. David's server had disappeared entirely. David ate what he could of his meal, which wasn't much. When he needed a refill on his water, he had to flag down a different server. When he tried to get his original server's attention to ask about dessert, the man walked past his table twice without making eye contact. Finally, David caught the server's attention as he was delivering coffee to another table. "Excuse me, could I see the dessert menu?" "We're out of most desserts," the server said without offering to check what might be available. "Could you check what you do have?" The server sighed heavily. "I think there's some tiramisu left. It's $8. I'll take it." The tiramisu, when it arrived 15 minutes later, was clearly frozen in the center and had the texture of cardboard. David ate a few bites and pushed it aside. Throughout his entire meal, no one had asked if his food was satisfactory or if he needed anything else. As David finished eating, he observed the restaurant's manager making rounds through the dining room. She was a woman in her 40s with dark hair and an expensive-looking outfit. David watched as she stopped at several tables, chatting warmly with customers and ensuring they were happy with their meals. But like the servers, she walked past David's table without acknowledgement. When David was ready to leave, getting his check proved to be another challenge. His server was nowhere to be found, and the other staff members seemed to actively avoid his table. Finally, he had to get up and walk to the hostess stand to request his check. The total came to $47 for what was easily the worst restaurant meal David had experienced in years. He paid with cash, leaving exact change as he wanted to see what reaction that would provoke. The manager herself came to collect his payment. She looked at the money on the table and then at David with open disdain. "No tip?" she asked loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "The service was adequate for the price I paid," David replied calmly. The manager's face flushed red. She snatched up the bills and then, in a move that shocked even David, threw the coins back at him across the table. Several quarters and dimes scattered across the table and onto the floor. "We don't need charity from people like you anyway," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "Maybe you should stick to restaurants more in your price range." The nearby tables had stopped their conversations to watch the scene unfold. David felt every eye in the restaurant on him as he calmly collected the scattered change from the table and floor. His face burned with embarrassment and anger, but he kept his voice steady. "Thank you for a memorable dining experience," he said as he stood up. "I won't forget it." The manager smirked, clearly satisfied that she had put him in his place. "I'm sure you won't," she replied. David walked out of Romano's Italian kitchen with his head held high, but his heart was racing with a mixture of anger and sadness. In all his years in the restaurant business, he had never witnessed such blatant disrespect toward a customer. The manager's behavior wasn't just unprofessional, it was cruel and deliberate. As he sat in his car outside the restaurant, David took several deep breaths to calm himself. He thought about his grandmother and how she would have felt watching what just happened. She had faced discrimination herself many times, working in jobs where she was treated as less than human simply because of who she was, but David also thought about his responsibility as the new owner of Romano's. This wasn't just about his own hurt feelings. If the staff treated him this way, how many other customers had faced the same humiliation? How many people had been made to feel unwelcome and unwanted in a place that was supposed to serve the public? David started his car and drove home, his mind already working on what needed to happen next. The manager and staff at Romano's had just shown him exactly what kind of restaurant they were running. Now it was time for him to show them what kind of owner he was going to be. David spent the weekend thinking about what he had experienced at Romano's. The anger had faded, replaced by something more focused and determined. He knew that one bad experience, even one as terrible as his, might not tell the whole story. Maybe he had caught the staff on a particularly bad night. Maybe the manager was having personal problems that affected her behavior. David believed in being fair, even when others weren't fair to him. So he decided to return to Romano's several more times before taking any action. If the treatment he received was an isolated incident, he would address it through training and clear expectations. But if it was part of a pattern, he would need to make more significant changes. On Monday evening, David returned to Romano's dressed in khakis and a button-down shirt. He thought maybe dressing slightly better might change how he was treated. It didn't. The same hostess seated him at the same table near the kitchen after another unnecessary wait. The service was just as poor, the food just as disappointing. When he paid with a credit card this time, the manager glanced at his name but showed no recognition. She processed his payment with the same cold efficiency she had shown before. David made notes on his phone during the drive home, documenting the details of each interaction. He noted the time it took to be seated, the quality of the service, the condition of the food, and how he was treated compared to other customers. If he was going to make changes, he wanted to have clear documentation of the problems. Wednesday evening brought the same results. This time, David wore a casual polo shirt and jeans, and he tried sitting at the bar instead of requesting a table. The bartender, a young man with numerous tattoos, initially seemed friendlier than the dining room staff. But as the evening went on, David noticed that the bartender was much more attentive to other customers, especially those who appeared to have money to spend on expensive drinks. David ordered a beer and the fish special. The beer was warm, and the fish was overcooked and obviously not fresh. When he mentioned to the bartender that the beer was warm, the response was a shrug and, "The cooler's been acting up." No offer to replace it or find a cold one. Meanwhile, David watched the bartender change the beer, tap and serve a perfectly cold beer to the customer who sat down next to him 10 minutes later. It was during this third visit that David began to notice something else troubling. He watched the manager, who he had learned was named Patricia from overhearing conversations, interact with the staff throughout the evening. She was demanding and often harsh with the younger employees, but he also noticed irregularities in how she handled money. David saw Patricia ring up a meal for a table of 4 as only 3 dinners. When the customers paid in cash, she pocketed the difference. Later, she allowed a couple at the bar to leave without paying their full tab, claiming their card was declined but making no effort to collect payment another way. David suspected these weren't mistakes but deliberate theft. By Thursday, David had seen enough to know that the problems at Romano's went far deeper than poor customer service. But he wanted one more visit to be absolutely certain of what he was dealing with. This time, he brought backup. His cousin Jerome, who managed one of David's other restaurants, agreed to visit Romano's with his girlfriend, Ashley. They would arrive separately from David and act as independent customers while observing how the staff treated different people. David trusted Jerome's judgment completely. Jerome had grown up in the same neighborhood and understood both the restaurant business and the importance of treating all customers with respect. Friday evening, David arrived at Romano's first, wearing a simple sweater and jeans. He requested a table for one and was given the usual runaround by the hostess. This time he timed everything carefully. From the moment he walked in until he was seated, took 38 minutes despite several empty tables being available throughout that time. Jerome and Ashley arrived 20 minutes after David was seated. David watched from his table as they approached the hostess stand. Jerome, who was dressed similarly to David in casual but neat clothing, received the same cold treatment David had experienced. The hostess told them there would be a significant wait despite the same empty tables David had observed. But then something interesting happened. A well-dressed white couple entered right behind Jerome and Ashley. The hostess immediately brightened, greeting them warmly and offering them their choice of available tables. They were seated within 3 minutes of walking through the door. David felt sick watching it happen, but he needed to see the pattern clearly. Jerome and Ashley were eventually seated at a table near the back, far from the windows and close to the service area, where they would be bothered by staff traffic all evening. Their service was just as poor as David's had been on his previous visits. David paid attention to every detail of his own service that night. His water glass sat empty for over 15 minutes before anyone refilled it. His order was taken with obvious impatience. His food arrived cold and poorly prepared. When he asked for Parmesan cheese for his pasta, the server acted as though he had made an unreasonable request. Meanwhile, tables around him received attentive service, hot food, and friendly conversation from the staff. The contrast was so obvious that David wondered if other customers noticed it too. Some probably did, but chose not to say anything. Others might have been oblivious to the different treatment happening right next to them. The most telling moment came when David was ready to pay. He had brought his phone and set it to record audio in his pocket. He wanted documentation of any verbal abuse he might receive. When Patricia came to process his payment, she looked at the exact change he left on the table and shook her head. "Let me guess," she said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "The service wasn't good enough for you?" "The service was exactly what I expected," David replied calmly. Patricia's face darkened. "People like you come in here expecting special treatment, then act like victims when you don't get it. This is a quality establishment. Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere else." David stood up slowly, maintaining eye contact with Patricia. "You're absolutely right," he said. "I would be more comfortable somewhere else. Somewhere that treats all customers with basic respect." "Good," Patricia replied. "Don't let the door hit you on the way out." As David walked toward the exit, he heard Patricia making comments to nearby staff members about difficult customers and people who don't understand fine dining. He kept walking, knowing that his phone had captured every word. Outside the restaurant, David waited for Jerome and Ashley to finish their meal. When they emerged 30 minutes later, their expressions told him everything he needed to know. Their experience had been just as bad as his, confirming that the poor treatment wasn't personal to David, but part of a systematic pattern of discrimination. "That was unbelievable," Ashley said as they stood on the sidewalk. "I've never been treated like that in a restaurant." Jerome shook his head. "The food was terrible, the service was worse, and that manager, man, she's got some serious problems. How does a place like that stay in business?" "It doesn't," David said quietly. "Not for much longer." That evening, David reviewed all his notes and the audio recording from his phone. The evidence was clear and overwhelming. Romano's wasn't just providing poor service. It was discriminating against customers based on race and perceived economic status. The manager was not only enabling this behavior but actively participating in it, while also apparently stealing from the business. David had given Patricia and her staff every opportunity to show him that his first experience was an exception. Instead, they had proven that discrimination and disrespect were the rule at Romano's Italian Kitchen. Now it was time for David to reveal who he really was and make the changes that should have been made long ago. As he prepared for bed that night, David thought about his grandmother again. She had always taught him that when you have the power to make things right, you have the responsibility to do it. Tomorrow he would begin using that power to transform Romano's into the kind of restaurant his grandmother would have been proud to visit. The staff at Romano's had no idea that their new owner had been sitting among them all week, experiencing firsthand the hostile environment they had created. They were about to find out that their behavior had consequences, and that change was coming whether they were ready for it or not. Monday morning arrived crisp and clear, and David Williams was up before dawn preparing for what would be one of the most important days in his business career. He had scheduled a mandatory staff meeting at Romano's Italian Kitchen for 10 o'clock, telling the assistant manager who answered the phone that the new owner wanted to address all employees before the restaurant opened for lunch. David chose his outfit carefully. He wore his best navy blue suit, a crisp white shirt and a tie that had belonged to his grandfather. His lawyer, Rachel Chen, would meet him at the restaurant, along with his human resources director and the new general manager he had hired to eventually replace Patricia. Everything was planned down to the smallest detail. The past weekend had been spent making final preparations. David had reviewed personnel files, financial records, and customer complaints that dated back 6 months. The picture they painted was even worse than what he had experienced personally. Romano's had received dozens of complaints about poor service, discriminatory treatment, and food quality issues. Most telling were the online reviews that described experiences almost identical to David's own visits. David also discovered that Patricia Torres had been the general manager for only 8 months. Hired by the previous owners when their longtime manager retired, her resume looked impressive on paper, with experience at several upscale restaurants in other cities. But when David's team made discreet inquiries, they learned that Patricia had left her previous positions under questionable circumstances, often related to staff conflicts and customer complaints. The financial records revealed even more problems. Inventory was disappearing at an alarming rate. Cash receipts didn't match the amount of food ordered, and there were numerous voids and discounts that didn't have proper documentation. Patricia was stealing, and she wasn't being subtle about it. At 9:30, David parked his car down the street from Romano's and walked toward the restaurant. Through the windows, he could see staff members gathering in the dining room. Some looked nervous, which was natural when meeting a new owner. Others appeared relaxed, probably assuming this would be a routine introduction followed by business as usual. Rachel Chen was already waiting by the front door when David arrived. She was a sharp, no-nonsense attorney who had handled all of David's business acquisitions. More importantly, she understood the legal complexities of workplace discrimination and wrongful termination. If any of the staff members he planned to fire today decided to challenge his decisions, Rachel would be ready. "Good morning, David," Rachel said, shaking his hand professionally. "Are you ready for this?" "I've been ready since Friday night," David replied. "Let's go change some lives." They entered Romano's together along with David's HR director Michael Santos and the new general manager Janet Brooks. Janet was a veteran restaurant manager with 15 years of experience and impeccable references. More importantly, she shared David's philosophy about treating all customers and employees with respect. The entire staff was assembled in the main dining room, sitting at tables that had been pushed together to create a meeting space. David quickly counted 12 people: servers, kitchen staff, the hostess, bartender, and Patricia. They looked up expectantly as the group of professionally dressed strangers entered the restaurant. Patricia stood up immediately, smoothing her blouse and putting on her most professional smile. "Good morning," she said, extending her hand toward David. "You must be from the new owner's company. I'm Patricia Torres, the general manager. Welcome to Romano's." David looked at Patricia's outstretched hand but didn't take it. Instead, he walked to the front of the room where everyone could see him clearly. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Patricia slowly lowered her hand, a puzzled look crossing her face. "Good morning, everyone," David said in a clear, calm voice. "Thank you all for being here this morning. I know you're expecting to meet someone from the new owner's company." He paused, making eye contact with several staff members. "I am the new owner. My name is David Williams, and I now own Romano's Italian Kitchen." A murmur went through the group as the staff tried to process this information. David watched their faces carefully, noting their reactions. Some looked surprised but pleased. Others seemed nervous. Patricia looked confused, as if she were trying to remember where she might have heard his name before. "Over the past week," David continued, "I've had the opportunity to visit this restaurant several times as a customer. I wanted to see firsthand what kind of operation I had purchased and how you treat the people who choose to spend their money here." The room went completely silent. David saw recognition dawning on Patricia's face as she began to remember the customer who had visited multiple times, the one she had treated so poorly. Her face went pale, and she sat down heavily in the nearest chair. "I think some of you are starting to remember me," David said, his voice still calm but carrying an edge of steel. "I was the customer who was told there would be an hour wait when tables were clearly available. I was the customer whose food arrived cold and whose service was deliberately poor. I was the customer whose change was thrown at him across a table while being told that people like me should find restaurants more in our price range." Several staff members looked down at their hands, while others glanced nervously at Patricia. The hostess, Kelly, was staring at David with her mouth slightly open, finally realizing who he was. David reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. "I recorded our last interaction, Patricia, so there would be no confusion about what was said." He played the audio file and Patricia's voice filled the room, dripping with contempt as she insulted David and made it clear that he wasn't welcome in the restaurant. When the recording ended, the silence was deafening. Patricia had put her head in her hands, and several staff members were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. This recording, David continued, along with my observations over multiple visits, shows a pattern of discrimination and poor service that is completely unacceptable. But it's not just about how I was treated. I watched you treat other customers the same way, based on how they looked or what you assumed about their ability to pay. David walked closer to the assembled staff. I need to be very clear about something. I've owned 11 successful restaurants for the past 15 years. Every single one of them operates on the principle that all customers deserve to be treated with respect, regardless of their race, their appearance, or how much money you think they have. That's not just the right thing to do, it's also good business. He gestured toward Rachel and his other team members. These are my attorney, my HR director, and the new general manager who will be taking over operations here. We've spent the weekend reviewing financial records, personnel files, and customer complaints. What we found was deeply troubling. Patricia looked up at David with tears in her eyes. Mr. Williams, I can explain— No, David interrupted firmly. You've had plenty of opportunities to explain your behavior, and instead you chose to double down on it. You've created a hostile environment for customers and, based on what I've observed, for your own staff as well. David turned to address the entire group. I want to be fair to everyone here. I understand that workplace culture comes from the top, and you may have been following the example set by your manager, so I'm going to give most of you a choice. You can commit to the new standards we're going to implement here, which include treating every customer with dignity and respect, or you can find employment somewhere else. He looked directly at Patricia. However, some behaviors are inexcusable and cannot be overlooked. Patricia Torres, your employment is terminated immediately. You'll receive your final paycheck, but your access to this restaurant ends today. Patricia started to protest, but Rachel stepped forward. Ms. Torres, we have documented evidence of discriminatory behavior toward customers and financial irregularities in your management of this restaurant. I strongly suggest you leave quietly. David continued down the line. Kelly Morrison, your behavior as hostess has been consistently discriminatory and unprofessional. Your employment is also terminated. He pointed to 2 servers who had been particularly rude during his visits. Robert Chen and Michelle Walsh, same applies to you. The remaining staff members sat in stunned silence as the reality of the situation sank in. David wasn't just making superficial changes. He was completely restructuring the restaurant's culture and management. For those of you who remain, David said, his voice becoming warmer, I want you to know that this restaurant can be something we're all proud of. Good service, quality food, and treating people right isn't just possible. It's the foundation of every successful restaurant. I'm willing to invest in training, better equipment, and fair wages for people who share these values. Janet Brooks stepped forward to introduce herself as the new general manager. We'll be spending the next 2 weeks retraining everyone, updating procedures, and making sure we all understand what excellent service looks like, she said. Anyone who's willing to commit to these new standards will have a place here. As the meeting broke up, David watched the dismissed employees gather their personal belongings and leave. Patricia walked past him without making eye contact, her earlier arrogance completely gone. The remaining IF members seemed uncertain but hopeful, probably wondering what working for David would really be like. David knew that this was just the beginning. Changing a restaurant's culture took time and consistent effort, but he also knew that what happened today would send a clear message throughout his organization and the local restaurant community. Discrimination and disrespect had no place in any business, especially not in one that bore his name. 3 months after that transformative Monday morning, David Williams stood in the dining room of what was now called Heritage Kitchen, watching the evening rush with satisfaction. The transformation had been even more dramatic than he had hoped. Where Romano's had struggled to fill half its tables, Heritage Kitchen now required reservations most nights of the week. The changes had started immediately after the staff meeting. David closed the restaurant for 2 weeks, much to the surprise of the local business community. During that time, he invested heavily in renovations, new equipment, and intensive staff training. The old, tired decor was replaced with warm, welcoming colors and comfortable furniture. The kitchen was updated with modern equipment that allowed the chefs to prepare fresh, quality meals consistently. But the most important changes were in the people and the culture. Janet Brooks had proven to be an exceptional general manager, implementing systems that ensured every customer received the same high level of service regardless of their appearance or background. The remaining staff members who had chosen to stay were retrained from the ground up, learning not just proper service techniques, but the philosophy behind treating every guest as a valued customer. David had also hired several new employees, carefully screening each candidate not just for experience but for attitude and values. The new hostess, Carmen Rodriguez, was a college student studying hospitality management who understood that the first impression customers received could make or break their entire experience. The new servers were experienced professionals who took pride in their work and understood that good service led to better tips and job satisfaction. Perhaps most importantly, David made himself a visible presence in the restaurant during the first months of operation. He didn't hide in an office or manage from a distance. Instead, he worked alongside his staff, greeting customers, helping with service during busy periods, and making sure everyone understood that quality and respect were non-negotiable standards. The early weeks had been challenging. Some customers came in expecting the same poor service they had received from Romano's and were surprised by the dramatic improvement. Others were skeptical, wondering if the changes would last or if this was just a temporary effort to rebuild the restaurant's reputation. David addressed these concerns directly by implementing a customer feedback system that actually worked. Comment cards were read and responded to personally. Online reviews were monitored and addressed professionally. When complaints arose, they were investigated thoroughly and resolved quickly. Customers began to trust that their concerns would be heard and addressed. The menu had been completely revamped as well. David brought in an experienced chef, Carlos Mendoza, who shared his commitment to quality and consistency. Carlos eliminated the overpriced, poorly prepared dishes that had characterized Romano's and created a new menu featuring fresh, locally sourced ingredients prepared with care and skill. The prices were reduced to reflect the restaurant's true position in the market, making quality food accessible to a broader range of customers. David would rather serve full tables at fair prices than empty tables at inflated prices. The strategy worked, with customer volume increasing dramatically while maintaining healthy profit margins. Word spread quickly through the community about the changes at Heritage Kitchen. Food bloggers began writing positive reviews. Local business people started choosing the restaurant for lunch meetings and client dinners. Most importantly, regular customers began returning, bringing friends and family members with them. David made a point of being present in the dining room several evenings each week, not to spy on his staff, but to connect with customers and ensure that the standards he had established were being maintained. He remembered names, asked about families, and made people feel genuinely welcome in his restaurant. One evening in the third month, David was greeting customers at the door when he noticed a familiar face. Jerome, his cousin who had helped him investigate Romano's, was walking in with Ashley and another couple. David smiled as he approached their table. "Jerome, Ashley, good to see you again," David said, shaking hands with his cousin. "How does this compare to your last visit?" Jerome grinned widely. "Man, it's like a completely different place. I mean, completely different. The service, the food, the whole atmosphere. You really turned this place around." Ashley nodded enthusiastically. "We've been telling everyone about this place. The staff is so friendly and the food is amazing. You should be really proud of what you've accomplished here." David felt a deep sense of satisfaction hearing their praise, but he knew the real measure of his success was in the day-to-day experiences of ordinary customers who had no idea who he was. Those were the people who kept coming back because they felt welcome and valued, not because they were trying to impress the owner. The financial turnaround had been just as dramatic as the cultural transformation. Heritage Kitchen was now profitable and growing more successful each month. The staff was earning better tips due to improved service, and David had been able to implement a health insurance program and performance bonuses that rewarded excellence. But David's satisfaction went beyond financial success. He had created something that would have made his grandmother proud. Heritage Kitchen had become a place where people from all backgrounds felt welcome, where families could afford to celebrate special occasions, and where his employees could build careers they respected. The story of Heritage Kitchen's transformation began spreading throughout the restaurant industry. David was invited to speak at industry conferences about the business case for treating all customers with respect. He always accepted these invitations, knowing that sharing his experience might inspire other restaurant owners to examine their own practices. "It's not complicated," David would tell audiences of restaurant owners and managers. "Treat people the way you want to be treated. Serve good food at fair prices. Train your staff to take pride in their work. The financial results will follow, but more importantly, you'll be running a business that contributes positively to your community." David never revealed the specific details of his undercover visits to Romano's in these presentations, feeling that the focus should be on positive change rather than past mistakes. However, word had spread through the industry about what had happened to Patricia Torres and the other employees who were terminated for discriminatory behavior. Patricia had struggled to find another management position in the local restaurant scene. The industry was smaller than many people realized, and reputation mattered. Her behavior at Romano's had become known throughout the community, making it difficult for her to find employment at reputable establishments. David occasionally heard updates about former Romano's employees through the industry network. Some had learned from their experience and found success at other restaurants where they applied the lessons they should have learned earlier. Others continued to struggle, never understanding that their own attitudes and behaviors were the source of their professional problems. As David stood in Heritage Kitchen that evening, watching families enjoy dinner together and servers take pride in providing excellent service, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The discrimination he had experienced at Romano's had been painful and humiliating, but it had also provided him with the motivation and insight needed to create something better. His grandmother's wisdom echoed in his mind as he watched his staff interact with customers of all backgrounds with warmth and professionalism. She had been right that treating people with respect was not just morally correct but also practically smart. Heritage Kitchen's success proved that doing the right thing was also good business. The restaurant industry could be challenging and competitive, but David had learned that the fundamentals never changed. Quality food, fair prices, excellent service, and treating everyone with dignity were not old-fashioned concepts but timeless principles that created lasting success. As the evening continued and Heritage Kitchen filled with the sounds of satisfied customers and busy staff, David knew that his investment had paid off in ways that went far beyond money. He had created a place that strengthened his community, provided good jobs for his employees, and honored the values his grandmother had taught him so many years ago. The transformation was complete, but David understood that maintaining excellence was an ongoing responsibility. Every day brought new opportunities to demonstrate that respect, quality, and fairness were not just business strategies, but fundamental values that defined who he was and what Heritage Kitchen represented.